Sabbath. Oh, all right, A plus. All right. Once again, it's always a privilege to be here. We changed the schedule up a little bit just because of things that were happening in our lives. My wife Jamie was supposed to be speaking today, but as we looked at the calendar, I won't be able to speak on my weekend next month, and so we flipped, and which apparently caused a snowball of other things. But here we are today. So. But as Jamie mentioned before, and as Michaela mentioned before, this is kind of a day of reflection. Just because it is Christina's birthday, and before when we were married, we were basically working, and then when Christina came along, our lives completely changed, and thank God for that. So today, the title of my sermon is called The Great Equalizer. And this has a whole bunch of different connotations to it, but as we get into it, I think you'll understand why. And I want to begin with a story. And this story happened probably about 70 years ago. I don't know, I can't remember the exact date. But it was a story that I read. It's a story that actually happened to one of my family members, one of my predecessors, my great-grandfather to be specific. He was a missionary. He had been in Japan most of his life, a lot of his life. He did not know any foreign languages growing up, but when he was 17 or 18, he and his wife moved to Japan. And part of their training was to be in the missions. They had to take the training in the native tongue, and so he had to take Japanese. And guess what? He did miserably poor. It was so bad that he actually felt impressed he should do it a second year. So he took 2 years of Japanese, and as a result of that, his love for the language and the people flourished. As the years would go by and successive years would go by, he was then able to write a Japanese English dictionary, which is still considered by most scholars in Japan today to be the premier dictionary in Japan. He was a linguist. He did serve time during World War II. He was part of the War Department. And afterwards, after the World War II was done and over with, he then went back to another part of Asia, the Philippines. And this is kind of where we pick up this story. And so, as you remember, the love between Japan and other Asiatic nations was not well. And in fact, we were just talking with our daughter last night. We have one of our friends' parents. They had a hard time buying a Japanese car for many years, and they were Chinese, just because of all the atrocities that had been committed. But this particular morning is something that is very sobering to think about. This was no particular average morning. My great-grandfather was awakened early because something was going to happen today, which was done in haste, but nonetheless, it was something commanded by the Philippines government. On this day, there were going to be prisoners of war executed, and they were not going to start unless my great-grandfather was there. And the reason is because he had spent time and effort showing those men the true gospel. And in fact, in his Bible, which my mom has, is recorded 7 signatures of men who changed their lives and gave their lives to Christ. It was, in effect, signing into his Bible was almost like signing the book of life. He arrives at the prison, and what he sees is it's a dynamic scene. In one particular corner, you have a Buddhist who is ranting and raving and just chanting with his spiritual leader and just very anxious. You have the stoic atheist Japanese officer who very calmly, yet shaking in his boots, hands my great-grandfather a letter to give to his wife on his way to the gallows. Men died that day, whether it was justified or not. But as one of the Seventh-day Adventist converts was standing on the gallows with the noose around his neck, turned to my great-grandfather and said, "Professor, see you in the morning." A dynamic scene. All those men, the same fate that same very day. Are their outcomes going to be any different? And so today, we're going to look at something kind of sobering, kind of a sobering thought. And as kind of given my family a teaser last night as to what we'd be talking about. And the book that we're going to look today is a book that we kind of overlook. We don't really talk about it much. In fact, in evangelical circles, they don't know why it's in the Bible to begin with. And that is going to be, guess what book? It's a Bible book. It's not an Ellen White book. It's called the Ecclesiastes. It's the great Equalizer. If you can look at this book of the Bible, it really shows humanity for where it is and what the folly of this world is like. And it also, in the end, tells us where we should be putting our efforts. And so and my question today is, who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes? Solomon, right? I mean, it even says so in the opening lines. It says here, and before we do that, let's just go ahead and say a word of prayer. Dearly Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for everything you've done for us, Lord. We just ask you to cleanse our hearts, cleanse our minds, and be with us now as we open up your word and help us to understand how you want us to live for you today. We pray this in thy name. Amen. And so let's go ahead and turn to Ecclesiastes. And just look at the opening lines just for a second here. Ecclesiastes 1, verse 1. And it says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is" what? Vanity. So who was Solomon? Do we have any idea who Solomon was besides a king of Israel, right? Who was he? The son of the son of David. He was not the first son. We know what happened to the first son, right? And in fact, and when you look at even Solomon's coronation and how that all came down, it was like fraught in controversy, was it not? But looking at 1 Kings chapter 10 gives us a really good idea who he was. I mean, we know he built the temple, right? Earlier on in that, in 1 Kings chapter 3, he's basically, after he's solidified on the throne, he actually has a dream, right? Remember that dream? And he's like, basically God comes to him and says, "What do you want, Solomon?" And he's like, "I don't know what to ask for. Just give me wisdom." And God's like, "You don't want the riches of this world and stuff like that?" And Solomon's, "Just give me wisdom. I'm a child. I have no idea what I'm getting into. Give me wisdom on how to do this." That is an awesome prayer. In addition to the wisdom, however, what does Solomon also get? He gets the booty. He gets the riches, correct. And it's so much so, his wisdom has gone so far and so wide that even the queen of Sheba has to come to Jerusalem herself because she does not believe the reports. The reports are too fantastic, and so she has to come herself and to see it for her own eyes. And then she exclaims, it was in verse 6 of chapter 1 Kings 10, she says, it was a true report which I have heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe these words until I came and saw them with my own eyes. And indeed, it was not half of what was told me. So the reports that she was getting was even half of what she saw. Isn't that amazing? And as you look further down through 1 Kings chapter 10, you just read through that, and just everything that he amassed, horses, gold, tribute. It was just amazing. Israel was at its high point, all right? But then, unfortunately, we turn over to 1 Kings chapter 11, and we read about what? His folly, his downfall, right? And it's very much accepted that as we pick up the story, or go back to Ecclesiastes now, that Ecclesiastes was actually written, when do you think? After all his mess, right? He's looking back on his life, and he's basically saying, I really screwed up. And it's interesting when you look at the Bible commentary on this. There's 8 different parts. You have the prologue, which they entitled The Futility of Life, and that's typically from Ecclesiastes 1 to 1:11. The second part is the conquest for happiness, Solomon's conquest for happiness. Number 3 is a season for everything. 4 is 4 ideals. 5 is the folly of life. 6 is the things worth living. 7 is the search for wisdom, and then 8, which is the epilogue, and what God expects of man. And we're going to take a look at some of these today. So let's turn now back to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. And it says, once again, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. In fact, some translations use the word, what? Meaningless. It says, one generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises and the sun goes down, hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes toward the south and turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually, and it comes again on its circuit. The rivers, all the rivers run to the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, they return again. All things are full of labor. Men cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is what will be, and that which is done will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Did you get that? There's nothing new under the sun. It was kind of interesting. We just, with the Pathfinders, we were working on the computer honor, and we learned, guess where the computer had its origins? How many years ago? Pathfinders? A long time ago. It was a Chinese abacus is the inception of the computer. So the computer's not new. It's been around for millennia. We've just made it faster, and we've actually given it more privilege than we ever should. There's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything which may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. Just for the fun of it, I kind of asked the kids who Clark Gable was. Guess what? They had no answer. Right? Because who is he? He was an actor many years ago, right? And hence, long forgotten, right? The actors of today, the people on stage, the big names, today will be what? A byword tomorrow. They'll have their glory, but just for a season. The vanity of wisdom. I, the preacher, was king over all Jerusalem, Israel, over all Israel in Jerusalem. and I set my heart to seek and search out wisdom concerning all things done under the sun, this burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which it may be exercised. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity, a grasping after the wind. And what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness, and I have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart understood great wisdom and knowledge. I have set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is what? A grasping after the wind. Have you tried grasping the wind? Try it sometime. I think people will kind of refer you to behavioral health after a while. Right? It's impossible. You can't grasp what you can't see or what's fast moving. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. And so here we see, Solomon, he's trying to find the meaning of what's the point of all this, right? The cycles of nature. I mean, if you think about it, everything just seems to kind of run its course. Day in, day out, day in, right? Yes, no. Yeah. And so he sees this, and it doesn't take much. So as we move to chapter 2, it says, I said in my heart, come now, I will test with mirth, therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely these also was vanity. And so basically what this is Solomon kind of reflecting on his life. He's like, he had all this wisdom, and then he almost got bored, And so he's like, I'm just gonna do whatever my heart desires, right? And so he goes into this recalling of what he did. He said, he searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom. So he's trying to mix what? Where did his wisdom come from? God, right? So he's trying to mix his wisdom with the fun and pleasures of the world. See that? And is that dangerous? Extremely dangerous. As we kind of say, as people say, it's kind of 1 foot in the world and 1 foot with God. Who's going to win? Yeah, and as we know, Solomon lost miserably, right? He married wives of foreign nations, not just one. If one's enough, one's enough, believe me. He had 300. Yeah, he had it was just way too much. But in doing so, he also started embracing their gods, right? So I searched in my heart, I sat, gratifying my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay a hold on folly till I see what is good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. I made my work great. I built myself houses. I planted vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards and fruit trees. I made myself pools of water to which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants. I had servants born to my house, possessions and herds and flocks. The list goes on and on and on. He says in verse 10, whatever I desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. Then he takes a step back, and he says, then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and all the labor which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity, a grasping after the wind. There was no profit in that. He's like, I did all these great things, I accomplished all this stuff, but you know what? In the end, it's just like chasing the wind. He then turns to wisdom. He says, I turn myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can a man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. And when I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness, and the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness, yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was then I more the wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. For there's no more remembrance of the wise than the fool forever, since all that is now will be forgotten in the days to come. And so he just continues this process of looking at the reality of life. He looks to his labor in 18. He talks about how he labored all his life. I just abhor the thought of leaving it to the guy after me, right? That's what he basically says. He says in verse 18, 19, he said, Then I hated all my labor which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And do we know if Rehoboam was any better? And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will rule over my labor for which I have toiled, which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also was vanity. Kind of depressing to think about it. But he says, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But the sinner he gives the work of gathering, collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity, a grasping after the wind. And then as we turn over to chapter 3, this is the only 60s pop song you could sing in church. Right? Did you know that? In 1965, there was a group called the Byrds. And guess what they did? They made Ecclesiastes 3, 1 to 8 into a song. And recorded it. We're not going to play it, don't worry. But that's where they got the words from. They got their words exactly, word for word, from Ecclesiastes 1, or Ecclesiastes 3, 1 to 8. And so, and after all that, we'll skip down to 16. He says, Moreover, I saw in the sun a place of judgment. The wickedness was there, and a place of righteousness. Iniquity was there. I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every purpose and every work. I said in my heart concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them that they may see that they themselves are like animals. For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them, as one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all shall return. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which go upward, and the spirit of the animals, which goes down to the earth? So it perceived nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his work. For that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen? And then verse 4, it just talks about more turmoil. And I consider the oppression that was done in the sun, the tears of the oppressed. But at the same time, those who are oppressed and those who are the oppressor, guess what happens to them? Eventually they get what? It's the same fate, right? And so Solomon goes on, and he talks about, like I said, the contrast, wisdom and folly. And then skipping over to chapter 9, he said, verse 1, For I considered all this in my heart, so that I could declare it all, that the righteous and the wise, their works are in the hand of God. People know neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them. All things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, the clean, and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and to him who does not sacrifice. As it is good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath, as he who fears an oath. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead. But for him who is joined to all the living, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. And this is one of the areas where most evangelicals have a problem with Ecclesiastes, because it brings out a very prominent truth that we believe as Seventh-day Adventists. It says, for the living know that they shall die, but the dead what? And they have no more reward, for their memory of them is forgotten. Their love, their hatred, and their envy is now perished. Nevermore will they have a share in anything done under the sun. And so he gives some good advice after following this. He says, go eat your bread with joy, and drink wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white, and let your head lack no oil. Live joyfully with the wife from whom you love all the days of your life, of your vain life, which he has given you under the sun, all the days of your vanity, for this is your portion in life, and the labor which you perform under the sun. And here's the important part, and if you think about this, he gives some very good wisdom in this next line as well. He says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with might, for there's no other work or device or knowledge or wisdom that in the grave where you're going. So he says, do whatever you do well. And that's missing in society today, isn't it? It's how much can I just get by with? It's not, let's go over the top. Let's make this the best. So whatever we find our hands to do, we need to do with what? With might. We need to do it well. And he goes in, towards the close of chapter 9, he kind of goes into a little story here. It's kind of interesting. He says in 14, there was a little city with a few men in it, and a great king came against it, besieged it, and built a great stairs around it. And now there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered the name of that poor man. He then said, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. The words of the wise are spoken quietly, should be heard rather than the shout of a ruler of fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but the sinner destroys much. And so Solomon continues on, and he as he's getting ready to close his statement, he's kind of looking, once again, he's looking back from where? He's looking back over his whole life, right? And he's thinking about what he had done. He's thinking now that he should have spent his time, what? More wisely. Okay. And as he starts to wind down, we get into the famous passages that we mainly remember from Ecclesiastes, which is Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1, right? And what does that say? Yes, remember now your Creator when? The days of your, he's telling us to remember. Why? Because he knows that we are prone to forget. How does he know that we're prone to forget? Because guess what? He forgot, right? He's looking back and he's like, if only I had taken this to heart, right? He says, before the difficult days come and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them. While the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are not darkened, and the clouds do not return after the rain. In the day when the keeper of the house tremble and the strong men bow down, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look through the window grow dim. When the doors are shut and the sound of the grinding is low, when one rises up at the sound of a bird and the daughters of music are brought low. Also, they are afraid of height and terrors in the way. And when the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper is a burden, and the desire fails. For man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. And he's like, remember your Creator before the silver cord is loosed, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel is broken at the well. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return to God who gave it. Vanity of vanity, says the preacher. All is vanity. The conclusion continues. It says, moreover, because the preacher was wise, and he still taught people knowledge, yes, he pondered and sought out to set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was upright and words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and the words of a scholar are like well-driven nails given by one shepherd. Does anybody know what a goad is? A goad. It's a poking rod, okay? And usually a goad is something you do to herd sheep or cattle or something like that, right? You're trying to move something along by making them feel comfortable or uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable, right? Because if they're comfortable, guess what? They're not going to move, right? So he's saying here, the words of the wise are like a goad. So they're going to hopefully move you to do something, right? And the words of the scholar are like well-driven nails. Ouch. That hurts, right? But it's what you do with it's important, right? Do you move in the right direction, or do you move in the wrong direction? And says, and further, my son, be admonished by these, of making many books, there is no end, and much study and is wearisome to the flesh. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, and this is where he concludes again. He says, what? Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. So he concludes on reflecting, and he's like, everything is vanity, right? Except this. Everything is meaningless except this, keeping the commandments of God. And fear God and keep his commandments. And this word fear sometimes connotates what? What kind of feelings? Negative, right? But it all kind of depends upon how your relationship is, right? Okay, an example of this. So if your fire, let's say fire is a good example, for example. Okay? Fire is a good example. Is fire fearsome? Something to be worried about. In its context, right? Should you be fearful of a forest fire? Yes. What should you do from a forest fire? Run. Find safety. Get out of there, right? What about the fear of a fire in a campfire? It's what? It's very warming. It's very soothing, right? Do you remember a story about 3 men in a fire? Yeah. Were they fearful of the fire? They didn't. They were just like, whatever happens, happens. If God wants to save us, that's his job. If not, we're still going in. There was no fear. There's reverence, right? You reverence a campfire so it doesn't become a forest fire. Right? Not that we put God in a fire ring, but it's just an example. You know? So he's saying this, reverence God, fear him, keep his commandments, for this is yours and mine purpose. Which then brings us, if you look at other places in the Bible, Isaiah does a very good job about summing up Ecclesiastes. Did you know that? In like 4 verses. It's Isaiah 40. Verse 6 starts. Isaiah 40, verses 6, 7, and 8, it says, the voice said, cry out. And he said, what shall I cry? He says, all flesh is grass, and all its loveliness is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, because the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely people are what? Grass. The grass withers, the grass fades, but guess what? The word of our God stands for forever. That sums up Ecclesiastes, right? When you think about it, a blade of grass will see about 80 to maybe 100, if we're lucky, less springs than the human. That's a sobering thought. But we know that this is not the end, right? Because if it were, it's a miserable fate. And what's the point of everything, right? But we know it's not the end. And if we're going back to our story, what was the difference between the 3 groups of people that day? Because remember, you had a Buddhist chanting, just radically, just almost out of his mind. You had a stoic atheist, just cold in his heart, but yet shaking in his boots. You had the believer who was at peace with what was going to happen. That's mind-blowing. And we know, in looking through the eyes of the gospel, are their destinies any different? Well, that day they weren't, right? But the reality of it is that they do have different futures. And that kind of brings us back to our text today in Thessalonians. It says, but I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, verse 13, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and even so will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trump of God, with the dead of Christ shall rise first. Then we who are alive shall remain and shall be caught together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And thus we shall be with the Lord, always with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. Amen? And why can we believe this? Huh? Because God said it? Yeah. And how do we know God said it? Well, we have prophecy to help us out with that, right? I mean, it's just amazing when you look back through our timeline, how exacting prophecy is. I mean, it's so exacting that those who don't believe have to say that was written almost barely 1,200 years ago, right? They have to say that because it doesn't make sense to them. But the problem is when you find prophetic books that are as old as some scrolls of Isaiah, which date, 400 or 500 BC. You got problems with that, right? And it's interesting that even, I think it's the mayor's house in Munich, I believe, from what I've seen in previous pictures, they actually have the beasts of Revelation or of John of Daniel there over the lintel. It's interesting. So we have these truths, and so the question is, how are we living our lives? How are we influencing those around us so that they can have the same fate as those 7 men? So with that in mind today, let's be wise of what's happening around us and find ways to share what we know, because it doesn't do any good to know all this stuff and just keep it to ourselves, right? We got to share it in any way that God allows. And so we need to be assertive and try to help those who are struggling and help them to see the greater light. And that's kind of an interesting thing about Ecclesiastes, and that's why I kind of labeled my sermon the Great Equalizer, because in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon just lays everything flat, right? But he also gives the hope of salvation of God as well. And that, who knows, can maybe be a niche or a key to getting to somebody about the gospel. So as we go through our lives, through next week, is my prayer that not only for myself, but for those here, that we just find some way, somehow this week, to influence somebody for God. Because we have this great news. And with that, our closing hymn today actually is, we have this hope.